Biography: Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and the secrets of the Third Reich. Who was Albert Speer? Albert Speer was one of Adolf Hitler's closest confidants and the chief architect behind the visual spectacle of the Nazi regime. Born in Mannheim, Germany, in 1905, he rose from a promising architect to become the Minister of Armaments during World War II, responsible for organizing the Reichswehr production. Unlike many of his peers, Speer managed to craft an image of remorse and intellect during the Nuremberg Trials, often being labeled the Nazi who said sorry. But was his guilt genuine or calculated? His autobiographical works, including Inside the Third Reich, have shaped how we view him today. This documentary explores the man behind the façade, his designs, decisions, power, and ultimate fall. Was Albert Speer a tragic figure caught in history, or an opportunist hiding behind brilliance? Do you believe Albert Speer was truly remorseful, or did he just want to save himself from execution? 1. Birth in the Empire, March 1905, Mannheim, German Empire. Albert Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in the industrial city of Mannheim, located in the Grand Duchy of Baden, part of the German Empire. At the time, Germany was a recently unified nation under Kaiser Wilhelm II, undergoing rapid industrialization and asserting itself as a growing European power. Speer's birthplace, Mannheim, was known for its orderly grid-like city plan and bustling commercial life. His family belonged to the educated bourgeoisie, a respected social class composed of professionals and academics, often aligned with conservative, nationalistic ideals. Albert was the second of 3 sons in the Speer household. His father, Albert Friedrich Speer, was a successful architect with a specialization in structural and urban planning. The elder Speer operated his own architectural firm and was known in southern Germany for his traditional and restrained building style. He expected his sons to follow in his professional footsteps and maintain the family's respectable status. Albert's mother, Louise Mathilde Wilhelmine Hommel, came from a cultured and wealthy family. Her father, Konrad Hommel, was a well-known painter and portraitist, and this artistic lineage subtly influenced Albert's later appreciation for aesthetics, art, and design. The Speer household was marked by emotional reserve and rigid expectations. Albert's father was distant and demanding, rarely offering praise or affection. His mother, while more emotionally expressive, maintained strict discipline. Albert would later reflect on his childhood as cold, structured, and devoid of spontaneous warmth. The culture of obedience and order that defined German middle-class households in the early 20th century was particularly strong in the Speer family. This environment fostered in young Albert a desire to excel within rules rather than challenge them, a trait that would shape much of his adult life. As a child, Albert was quiet, introspective, and obedient. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and drawing, and often worked with his hands, building models and sketching buildings. These hobbies were encouraged by his father, who saw them as signs of an emerging architectural mind. His early exposure to technical design and spatial reasoning helped him develop a strong visual and structural sensibility. His family lived in a large, stately home furnished with fine German craftsmanship, surrounded by books, music, and paintings. This cultivated environment emphasized refinement, professionalism, and loyalty to the fatherland. World War I erupted when Albert was only 9 years old. The war transformed Germany's political and social fabric, and its effects rippled through every German household, including the Speers. Food became scarce, inflation rose sharply, and public morale plummeted. Despite their relative wealth, the Speers faced rationing and shortages like most German families. Albert's school years were colored by patriotic indoctrination and nationalistic fervor. Teachers emphasized duty, sacrifice, and German cultural superiority. He observed his older relatives either volunteer or be conscripted into the military, and the glorification of war heroes became part of his daily reality. The end of the war in 1918 brought not only Germany's defeat but also its political collapse. The abdication of the Kaiser and the birth of the Weimar Republic marked a chaotic transition for the country. For many in the upper middle class, including the Speers, this was seen as a betrayal of traditional German values. The humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse, and political instability made a strong impression on young Albert. His family, like many others in Germany, gravitated toward the idea that the nation had been stabbed in the back by traitors and leftists, an idea that would later be central to Nazi propaganda. Although Albert Speer never served in the military, the emotional and ideological impact of World War I would remain with him for life. The disillusionment, national shame, and longing for order and greatness echoed through his generation. He came of age in a Germany filled with wounded pride and simmering resentment, where stability was elusive and political violence commonplace. This collective trauma created fertile ground for extreme ideologies and charismatic leaders to rise, and Speer, like many others of his class and education, would eventually find in Adolf Hitler a compelling vision of national redemption. By the time Albert finished high school, the path laid out for him was clear. Following his father's profession seemed not only expected but inevitable. Architecture was seen not as an art, but as a noble science, one that could restore beauty, order, and identity to a fractured Germany. Speer would later write that he never experienced any real rebellion against his upbringing, nor did he question the values he had been taught. The world he inherited was one of precision, hierarchy, and ambition, and his journey into adulthood would carry those principles into the most destructive regime of the 20th century. 2. The Architect's Path, 1923 to 1931. In 1923, at the age of 18, Albert Speer began his formal architectural education by enrolling at the Technical University of Munich, one of the most respected institutions for engineering and design in Germany. His decision followed his father's wishes and family tradition, but Albert approached his studies with quiet determination rather than passion. The early 1920s were a time of intense social and economic unrest in Germany, marked by hyperinflation, political street violence, and deepening public distrust in the Weimar Republic. But inside the walls of the university, students like Speer pursued rigorous technical disciplines far removed from the chaos outside. Speer's early academic performance was solid but not extraordinary. His instructors recognized his discipline and talent for clean, functional design, though they noted a lack of originality in his concepts. He largely avoided politics during his first years at university. He lived modestly, focused on coursework, and maintained close contact with his family. In these years, Speer developed a preference for neoclassical architecture, favoring symmetry, order, and monumentality. These stylistic choices aligned with the broader German yearning for stability and tradition in a time of national disorientation. After completing 2 years in Munich, Speer transferred in 1925 to the more prestigious Berlin Institute of Technology, Technische Hochschule Berlin, which offered greater exposure to the architectural scene and cultural life of Germany's capital. Berlin in the 1920s was a city of contrasts. Modernist avant-garde movements clashed with traditional values, and the Weimar Republic struggled to hold together an increasingly polarized society. For a young man like Speer, Berlin presented both opportunity and tension. He remained aloof from political debates, preferring the structured world of drafting tables and design studios to the chaos of revolutionary street marches and ideological disputes. It was in Berlin that Speer came under the influence of Heinrich Tessenow, one of the leading architects and theorists of his time. Tessenow was known for his minimalist and classical approach, emphasizing clean lines, harmonious proportions, and understated beauty. Unlike many of his peers, Tessenow rejected the radical experimentation of the Bauhaus school and instead drew inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman architecture. He believed architecture should serve society by reflecting moral order and national character. Speer absorbed these ideas deeply, and they became the foundation of his own aesthetic philosophy. Tessenow also left a personal impression on Speer. A quiet, principled man, he demanded honesty and simplicity in both design and character. He disapproved of flashy ambition and intellectual showmanship. Speer, eager to please and quietly competitive, mirrored his mentor's values and later credited Tessenow with shaping his architectural thinking. But even as a student, Speer lacked the depth of philosophical commitment that Tessenow hoped to instill. He adopted the forms of classical architecture more than its moral purpose. Later critics would note that Speer mastered the language of monumental architecture, but rarely questioned its political use. In 1927, Speer earned his degree and stayed on as Tessenow's teaching assistant. This position gave him a modest salary and allowed him to develop his skills in both teaching and practice. His lectures were technically sound but uninspiring. He remained shy, methodical, and reluctant to assert himself. Colleagues described him as serious and courteous, with little to say outside his area of study. He had few close friends and lived a largely solitary life. This low profile would serve him well in the coming decade, as he would rise quickly through the ranks of the Nazi elite without drawing too much attention. During this period, Speer met and fell in love with Margaret Weber, the daughter of a successful craftsman from Heidelberg. Margaret was quiet, traditional, and devoted, an ideal match for a man like Speer, who valued order and predictability in his personal life. The two married in 1928 and would go on to have 6 children. Their marriage was mostly private, with Margaret preferring domestic life and avoiding the political spotlight that would later surround her husband. She supported Speer's ambitions but remained largely in the background, offering him a stable home in contrast to the turbulence of his professional world. By 1930, Speer had opened a small architectural practice in Berlin. Like many young architects during the Great Depression, he struggled to find clients. Germany's economy was faltering again, and the construction industry was hit particularly hard. Commissions were rare, and many architects took government contracts or left the profession altogether. Speer managed to survive financially thanks to family support and small jobs, but he felt increasingly frustrated by his lack of recognition. He longed for a breakthrough, an opportunity to demonstrate his talent on a larger stage. It was in this environment of economic desperation and national disillusionment that the Nazi Party began gaining traction. The party's promises of renewal, unity, and national pride resonated deeply with the German middle class, including architects like Speer who saw their careers stagnating and their country directionless. Though not particularly political, Speer began attending party rallies and lectures out of curiosity and social pressure. He was struck by the organization, discipline, and theatrical power of the Nazi movement. The party's emphasis on architecture, symbolism, and spectacle appealed to his visual sensibilities. At the time, Adolf Hitler was still viewed by many in the professional class as a fringe populist. But within certain circles, his charisma and vision were gaining legitimacy. For Speer, who had been trained to value form, scale, and grandeur, Hitler's architectural rhetoric was compelling. The stage was being set for Speer's unlikely rise to power. He had the skills, the connections, and, most importantly, the right temperament to navigate the emerging Nazi state. In the years to come, his quiet ambition and aesthetic talent would place him closer to Hitler than nearly any other civilian, transforming him from a modest draftsman into the chief architect of a regime bent on total domination. 3. Meeting the Reich, 1931 to 1934. In 1931, Albert Speer made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, not out of deep ideological conviction, but more out of curiosity and social environment. He was introduced to the movement through one of his professors, who invited him to attend a lecture by Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief. The event took place at the Berlin University of Technology. Goebbels spoke with fiery rhetoric about Germany's humiliation after World War I, the failings of the Weimar Republic, and the promise of national rebirth under Adolf Hitler. Speer, still in his mid-20s, was captivated. He would later claim that the decision to join the Nazi Party was casual and politically naive, but in truth, his choice aligned with a growing trend among Germany's educated middle class. Many professionals felt alienated by liberal politics, economic instability, and cultural modernism. The Nazis offered something different: discipline, purpose, and a return to national strength. For someone like Speer, who valued order, structure, and ambition, the party's aesthetics and messaging were seductive. He applied for membership and received party number 474,481, one of many, but a step that placed him on a path toward power. At first, Speer's involvement with the party was limited. He continued to work on small architectural projects, teach part-time, and attend occasional rallies. But the turning point came in 1932, when he was hired by Karl Henke, a rising Nazi official, to complete a renovation on the Berlin district headquarters of the party. Speer performed the job efficiently and with great attention to detail, impressing Henke. The work led to additional small projects for party members, each one bringing Speer further into the Nazi network. That same year, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg. Although Hitler lost, the campaign brought him to national prominence. The Nazis were rapidly becoming the most organized and powerful political force in Germany. Speer remained on the fringes, still presenting himself as a technician rather than an ideologue. But he watched the events unfold with growing interest and quiet calculation. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party, once dismissed as a radical fringe, was now in control of the state. Speer's first major commission from the new regime came soon after the Nazi seizure of power. In March 1933, Joseph Goebbels contacted Speer to redesign and decorate the new Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in Berlin. The job required speed, discretion, and political reliability. Speer accepted without hesitation. Working almost non-stop for 48 hours, he transformed the interior of the ministry into a showcase of power and modernity, using banners, lighting, and symbolic forms to project strength and control. The project caught the attention of top Nazi officials, and more importantly, of Hitler himself. In September 1933, Speer was given a much larger task, designing the stage and layout for the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. The event was central to the Nazi calendar, a massive propaganda spectacle meant to unite the party faithful and display the power of the movement to the nation. Speer approached the task with technical precision and a theatrical eye. He arranged hundreds of flags, torches, and searchlights to create overwhelming visual effects. The Cathedral of Light, as it came to be called, used 130 anti-aircraft searchlights placed in a circle to form vertical columns of light stretching into the night sky. It was a chilling and unforgettable image. The rally was a triumph for the Nazis, and for Speer. His architectural vision had helped elevate the event into a political myth. For Hitler, who valued spectacle as a political weapon, Speer's work was more than impressive, it was essential. Hitler praised the young architect's creativity, discipline, and understanding of visual power. The two men met personally after the rally, and their rapport was immediate. Hitler, himself a failed artist and painter, admired architects deeply. He found in Speer someone who not only shared his aesthetic taste but also delivered results without ego or delay. Speer, for his part, was flattered by the attention. He later wrote that Hitler treated him like a friend and intellectual equal. The praise from the Führer awakened in him a sense of destiny. From this point on, Speer's career became inseparable from Hitler's ambitions. The young architect was now being entrusted with projects of national significance, working closely with the Nazi leadership, and joining Hitler on travels and meetings. His rise had begun, not through backroom politics, but through design, performance, and the visual articulation of power. By the end of 1933, Speer had moved into the inner circles of the Nazi regime. He still held no formal political office, nor did he belong to any Nazi paramilitary organization like the SS or SA. But his architectural work was now directly connected to the image and identity of the Third Reich. He designed parades, ceremonies, and public buildings, each one larger and more ambitious than the last. His success reflected the Nazi regime's belief in architecture as a form of propaganda, an embodiment of ideology through stone and steel. In private, Speer maintained a façade of political neutrality. He avoided party debates, rarely expressed opinions about policy, and insisted that his work was purely technical. But in reality, he was becoming an indispensable part of a system built on control, exclusion, and violence. The swastikas he etched into marble, the grandstands he built for rallies, the offices he renovated for propaganda ministers, all of these were tools of authoritarian rule. Whether or not he fully understood it at the time, Speer was no longer just an architect. He was now an instrument of the Nazi state. His proximity to power grew with each commission. By early 1934, he was being invited to private dinners with Hitler, sitting in on planning meetings, and overseeing large construction sites funded by the regime. Hitler referred to him as "my architect," a title that carried enormous weight in a government obsessed with aesthetics and symbolism. Speer's ability to navigate this world with quiet professionalism made him stand out. He was not a loud ideologue or a brutal enforcer. He was an efficient operator in a system that valued obedience and spectacle above all. The transformation of Albert Speer from an unknown draftsman to Hitler's trusted designer took less than 3 years. It was a combination of timing, talent, and temperament. In a Germany desperate for order and identity, Speer offered visual solutions that reinforced Nazi ideals. He avoided public speeches, kept his personal life out of view, and focused on delivering results. This discretion allowed him to rise quickly, while leaving few traces of dissent or hesitation. 4. Hitler's architect, 1934 to 1939. By 1934, Albert Speer had become a central figure in Adolf Hitler's inner circle. Although he held no formal political rank, he was already playing a critical role in defining the visual language of the Nazi regime. His rapid ascent was not based on ideology or ambition for public office, but rather on a unique blend of aesthetic skill, personal loyalty, and political discretion. Hitler valued loyalty and competence above all, and Speer offered both. He worked quickly, obeyed orders precisely, and never challenged authority. In return, Hitler granted him access, influence, and projects of unprecedented scale. One of Speer's earliest and most significant assignments was the redesign of the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. Beginning in 1934, Speer drew up master plans that turned the annual party rallies into cinematic performances. He designed the Zeppelin Field, a massive open-air stadium framed by towering stands and a colossal stone grandstand. His use of scale was deliberate, it dwarfed the individual and exalted the collective. The monumental architecture reflected Nazi ideals of unity, discipline, and dominance. Speer carefully planned lighting, sound systems, and stage effects to create emotional impact. These rallies were filmed by Leni Riefenstahl in her propaganda documentary Triumph of the Will, in which Speer's architectural stagecraft played a leading visual role. The rallies were more than political theater. They were engineered experiences intended to instill loyalty and awe. Speer understood how space and structure could be used to manipulate perception. His designs offered physical expressions of ideological values. Where the Weimar Republic had been seen as chaotic and weak, Speer's buildings projected permanence, strength, and order. Hitler was enthralled. He often walked through models and blueprints with childlike enthusiasm, imagining himself presiding over a reborn German empire. Speer not only realized Hitler's visions, he refined and amplified them. In 1936, Speer's responsibilities expanded dramatically. Hitler appointed him General Building Inspector for Berlin, granting him control over all construction projects in the capital. This appointment placed Speer above even the city's elected officials and gave him sweeping authority over urban planning, architecture, and zoning. Hitler had a grand vision: to transform Berlin into Welthauptstadt Germania, or World Capital Germania. It was to be a monumental capital that would rival Rome and Paris, filled with colossal boulevards, domes, and triumphal arches. Speer was tasked with making this dream real. The Germania project became the centerpiece of Speer's career in architecture. He developed master plans for an entirely new city center, including the Volkshalle, or People's Hall, an enormous dome structure inspired by ancient Roman temples. It was intended to hold over 180,000 people, with a dome rising more than 900 feet, about 275 meters, high, larger than the US Capitol and any building that had ever been constructed. Nearby, the Avenue of Victory would stretch over 3 miles, around 5 kilometers, lined with government ministries, museums, and statues. Speer poured enormous effort into these designs, producing detailed models and architectural plans. Despite the fantasy-like scale of the Germania project, construction did begin on some elements, including a massive new train station and several administrative buildings. However, most of the plans never left the model stage, as World War II and shifting priorities drained resources away from peacetime construction. Still, the ambition of the project showcased both Hitler's imperial aspirations and Speer's willingness to execute them without question. While other architects dabbled in ideology or aesthetics, Speer focused on logistics, engineering, and scale. He believed that beauty and power could coexist in stone, and he saw no contradiction between monumental design and authoritarian politics. During this period, Speer's personal relationship with Hitler deepened. The Führer invited him to dinners, private meetings, and retreats in the Bavarian Alps. Unlike many other Nazi officials, Speer avoided the party's backstabbing politics and power struggles. He was seen as loyal but apolitical, a professional in a system dominated by ideologues and opportunists. Hitler appreciated Speer's quiet demeanor and intellectualism. They shared a mutual love for art, music, and classical architecture. Hitler often referred to Speer as a genius, and Speer, in turn, described Hitler as a visionary with refined taste. Their bond blurred the line between professional collaboration and personal friendship. But Speer's success came at a cost. His projects required vast resources, labor, and political backing. He became increasingly reliant on the regime's machinery, its bureaucracy, its propaganda, and, eventually, its coercive power. To clear space for new buildings in Berlin, Speer oversaw the demolition of entire neighborhoods. Thousands of residents, many of them Jewish, were forcibly relocated. His office coordinated with the Gestapo and other state agencies to remove undesirables and make way for grand boulevards and monuments. He later claimed to have been unaware of the full extent of these actions, but official records show that his office worked closely with those implementing racial and political policies. Throughout these years, Speer presented himself as an architect serving his nation, not a political figure advancing a cause. He avoided party uniforms, rarely attended rallies outside of his own designs, and claimed to focus only on his work. But his projects, monuments, stadiums, ministries, became the physical symbols of a totalitarian regime. Whether he acknowledged it or not, his architecture gave form to Nazi ideology. The buildings were not neutral spaces, they were instruments of spectacle, control, and dominance. Speer's family life remained in the background. He and Margaret lived in an elegant home in Berlin, later moving to a villa in the wealthy suburb of Wannsee. The home was spacious and modern, decorated with art and furniture that reflected his classical tastes. Margaret managed the household and raised their children with little public presence. Speer rarely spoke about his personal life in later interviews, but letters and memoirs suggest that he maintained emotional distance from his wife and children. His work, and his proximity to power, consumed most of his time and attention. By 1939, Speer had firmly established himself as the Third Reich's master builder. His work had transformed the image of the Nazi state, giving it a visual identity that projected power, unity, and permanence. He stood at the peak of his architectural career, with Hitler's full trust and the nation's resources at his disposal. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 would change everything. Spee's skills would soon be redirected from monuments of grandeur to the machinery of war, setting him on a path toward even greater influence and far darker responsibilities. 5. The Minister of Armaments, 1942 to 1944. In February 1942, following the sudden death of Fritz Todt in a plane crash, Albert Speer was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. The appointment shocked many within the Nazi hierarchy. Speer was not a military man nor a trained economist. He had no experience managing industrial logistics on a national scale. Yet Hitler bypassed seasoned bureaucrats and engineers and chose his young architect to lead one of the most critical departments in wartime Germany. The decision was based not on credentials, but on trust. Hitler believed in Speer's efficiency, loyalty, and ability to deliver under pressure. At the time of Speer's appointment, Germany's war machine was beginning to falter. The invasion of the Soviet Union had turned into a brutal and protracted campaign. Allied bombings were crippling German industry, and supply chains were stretched thin. Weapons production was disorganized and fragmented among competing agencies, party officials, and private companies. Hitler tasked Speer with one mission: to transform this chaos into a streamlined and effective armament system capable of sustaining the war effort. Speer approached the job with characteristic discipline. He centralized control over armaments production, eliminating overlapping jurisdictions and reducing bureaucratic interference. He introduced performance-based metrics, rewarded efficiency, and pressured companies to increase output. One of his key innovations was the creation of the Central Planning Board, which allowed him to allocate raw materials, labor, and energy to sectors deemed vital for the war. Under his leadership, German armaments production rose dramatically, even as the Allies intensified their bombing campaigns. Between 1942 and 1944, output of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition increased by over 200%, despite worsening conditions on the battlefield. Speer's reforms were so successful that Allied analysts at the time believed Germany must have received aid from abroad, unaware that a single minister had reorganized the system internally. His talent for logistics and management drew comparisons to American industrialists like Henry Ford. He was often described as the miracle man of Nazi industry. But Speer's success came at a moral cost. To meet production demands, he increasingly relied on forced labor. Millions of foreign workers, many of them prisoners of war or civilians kidnapped from occupied territories, were transported to Germany to work in factories, mines, and construction sites. They labored under brutal conditions, often malnourished, beaten, and deprived of basic rights. Speer coordinated with Fritz Sauckel, the General Plenipotentiary for labor deployment, to secure this labor force. Though Speer later claimed he opposed Sauckel's methods, historical records show that he used these workers knowingly and without protest. His ministry also had direct ties to the SS and the concentration camp system. Many weapons factories were built near or within camps like Auschwitz and Mauthausen. Inmates were forced to produce ammunition, aircraft parts, and even V-2 rockets, often in underground facilities designed to avoid Allied bombing. Mortality rates in these labor camps were extremely high due to overwork, abuse, and unsanitary conditions. Speer was aware of these practices. His inspectors visited sites, filed reports, and communicated with SS officers. While he may not have overseen the camps directly, he benefited from the system they created. Publicly, Speer maintained an image of apolitical professionalism. He rarely gave speeches, avoided ideological language, and presented himself as a technocrat serving the state. This persona helped him gain the respect of the Wehrmacht, civilian officials, and industrial leaders. He met regularly with executives from companies like Krupp, IG Farben, and Messerschmitt, corporations deeply embedded in the Nazi war economy. He persuaded them to adopt new manufacturing techniques and expand production lines. In many ways, he served as a bridge between the Nazi leadership and German industry. Privately, Speer's relationship with Hitler remained close. The two met frequently, often discussing architecture as a retreat from military crises. Hitler continued to see Speer as a loyal friend, someone untainted by party rivalries and SS corruption. Speer used this favor to shield his ministry from interference, especially from figures like Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, who viewed him with suspicion. He maintained his position by staying out of ideological debates and focusing solely on results. His success in delivering weapons and ammunition secured his place at the top of the Nazi administrative elite. Yet even Speer could not escape the internal power struggles of the Third Reich. As Germany's military fortunes declined, competition among Nazi leaders intensified. Himmler, Bormann, Goebbels, and Göring all vied for influence. Spee's growing prominence made him a target. Bormann, who controlled access to Hitler, sought to undermine him by questioning his loyalty and accusing him of arrogance. Himmler tried to absorb parts of Spee's ministry into the SS apparatus. Spee responded by consolidating his networks, placing loyal subordinates in key positions, and lobbying Hitler directly to preserve his authority. By 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the Red Army was advancing from the east, and German cities were being leveled by bombing raids. Spee shifted his focus from expansion to survival. He established emergency factories in caves and tunnels, dispersed production across rural areas, and pushed for technical innovations, including the mass production of jet aircraft. He also began to question the long-term viability of the war. Though still outwardly loyal, his confidence in victory was fading. At this point, Spee began to distance himself, subtly, from the regime's most extreme measures. He refused to support Hitler's scorched earth orders, which called for the destruction of German infrastructure to prevent its capture by the Allies. He argued that Germany's future depended on preserving what could be saved. This opposition, though limited, would later be used by Spee to portray himself as a voice of reason within a collapsing dictatorship. Still, Spee remained a central figure in a system built on violence, repression, and conquest. His ministry's success depended on the exploitation of millions. His buildings and factories became symbols of a regime that sought to remake the world through force. Even as the Reich crumbled, Spee continued to plan, organize, and build, believing that order and productivity could somehow endure in the midst of destruction. By the end of 1944, Spee was arguably the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler. He controlled vast resources, commanded industrial output, and maintained the trust of the Führer. Yet he stood at the center of a system in collapse, surrounded by ruins he had helped create. The man who had once dreamed of classical beauty and monumental cities was now overseeing a war economy fueled by suffering and death. The line between ambition and complicity had long since disappeared. 6. Collapse of the Reich, 1944 to May 1945. By late 1944, the German Reich was on the verge of collapse. Allied forces had liberated Paris, pushed into Western Germany, and were bombing Berlin relentlessly. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing through Poland and into East Prussia. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was unraveling after just 12 years in power. Inside this failing regime, Albert Speer continued to serve as Minister of Armaments, but his role had evolved. He was no longer expanding production or designing new facilities. Instead, he was managing decline, improvising under pressure, and attempting to preserve what remained of Germany's industrial base. Speer's once powerful ministry was increasingly paralyzed by the chaos of war. Bombing raids destroyed factories, disrupted transport, and cut off raw materials. Skilled labor was in short supply. Railway lines were shattered, and the German economy was fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance. Yet even in this environment, Speer managed to keep some production going, moving facilities underground, building makeshift workshops, and relying more heavily on forced labor. He had become the chief manager of a crumbling empire, using organization to delay inevitable defeat. As the military situation deteriorated, internal rivalries within the Nazi regime intensified. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, sought to expand his control over the Führer's appointments and isolate competing voices. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, operated his own industrial empire based on concentration camp labor and saw Speer as a rival. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, pushed for total war measures that often clashed with Speer's attempts to protect infrastructure. In this environment, trust was rare, and sabotage, political and administrative, was common. Speer attempted to navigate these power struggles with caution. He continued to maintain a close relationship with Hitler, who still saw him as a loyal servant and brilliant manager. Speer used his access to defend his ministry from encroachment, while also taking subtle steps to counter some of the regime's most destructive policies. One of the most dramatic examples was his opposition to Hitler's Nero Decree, issued in March 1945. The Nero Decree, officially titled the Demolitions on Reich Territory Decree, ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure, factories, transportation networks, utilities, and even cultural landmarks, to deny their use to advancing Allied forces. Hitler believed that if Germany could not win, it should not survive. If the war is lost, he said, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. Speer, however, recognized the madness of the plan. He argued that the German people would need roads, bridges, and power plants to rebuild after the war. He feared that Hitler's scorched earth policy would condemn millions to starvation and permanent ruin. In a rare act of defiance, Speer claimed to have quietly sabotaged the decree. He instructed regional officials to ignore destruction orders, and in many cases, they complied. Railways, water systems, and power grids were preserved in parts of western and southern Germany, thanks in part to Speer's resistance. Later, during his trial at Nuremberg, he used this act to portray himself as a humanitarian and rational actor in the midst of fanaticism. However, some historians have questioned the scope and impact of his resistance, suggesting it may have been exaggerated in hindsight. As the war entered its final weeks, Speer's position became increasingly tenuous. He visited Hitler in the Führerbunker in Berlin on several occasions during March and April 1945. These underground meetings, surrounded by collapsing walls and exhausted officers, revealed the psychological decline of the Nazi leadership. Hitler appeared disoriented, angry, and delusional. He ranted about betrayal, Jewish conspiracies, and future weapons that would change the course of history. Speer, while outwardly respectful, began to lose confidence in the man he had once admired. In his final personal meeting with Hitler, on April 23, 1945, Speer claimed to have confessed his disobedience of the Nero decree. Hitler reportedly listened in silence, then turned away, saying nothing. It is unclear whether this account is entirely true, but it marked a symbolic break between the two men. Speer left Berlin shortly after, traveling through the collapsing remnants of the Reich. He visited factories, met with local officials, and gave vague instructions for surrender. Some accounts suggest he considered committing suicide, while others say he hoped to negotiate a role in post-war reconstruction. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces. The war in Europe was over. Hitler had taken his own life in the bunker on April 30th, and his closest allies were either dead or in hiding. Speer was captured by American troops on May 23 near Hamburg, along with other senior members of the Nazi regime. Unlike many of his peers, he did not resist arrest, flee, or attempt to disappear. Instead, he cooperated with interrogators and presented himself as a technocrat, not a war criminal. At the time of his arrest, Speer carried with him notes, papers, and early drafts of what would later become his memoirs. He appeared eager to explain himself, to tell his version of the story. In Allied custody, he admitted his role in managing German industry but denied knowledge of the Holocaust or direct involvement in crimes against humanity. He portrayed himself as an apolitical manager who had served his country, not its ideology. This narrative would shape his image in the years to come, an image that remains deeply contested. Speer's final act in the war was not building, designing, or managing, but surviving. He walked away from the ruins of a regime he had helped construct, prepared to reframe his legacy. His arrest marked the end of Nazi Germany and the beginning of one of the most controversial redemption stories of the 20th century. 7. Judgment at Nuremberg, 1945 to 1946. After his arrest in May 1945, Albert Speer was transported to a detention center at Mundorf-les-Bains in Luxembourg, where the Allied forces were holding senior members of the Nazi regime. The site, nicknamed Ashcan by American troops, housed men like Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Rudolf Hess. Speer stood out from the others. He was cooperative, articulate, and introspective. Unlike many of his fellow prisoners who remained defiant or delusional, Speer appeared calm, even thoughtful. He read, wrote, and spent hours preparing for what would become the most important trial of his life. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg, Germany, to prosecute the most prominent surviving Nazi leaders. It was the first trial of its kind in history, an attempt to hold individuals criminally responsible for crimes against humanity, rather than blaming an entire nation or military. 24 men were indicted, including political leaders, military commanders, and industrial administrators. Speer was charged with 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. From the beginning, Speer's strategy differed from that of his co-defendants. While others denied responsibility, blamed Hitler, or claimed ignorance, Speer admitted to his role in the Nazi government. He acknowledged that he had supported Hitler's goals, managed the war economy, and used forced labor. He did not deny the existence of concentration camps, though he insisted he had no direct knowledge of the Holocaust until the end of the war. His testimony was carefully crafted, an admission of guilt without specific criminal acts. Speer's defense argued that he was a technocrat, not a policymaker. He had not participated in military planning or racial legislation. He had focused on logistics, production, and infrastructure. He did not belong to the SS, and he had occasionally pushed back against extremist policies. But he did not claim innocence. Instead, he positioned himself as a man who had made grave moral errors, someone who had become part of a criminal regime out of ambition, blindness, or misplaced loyalty. During his testimony, Speer made a powerful and unexpected statement. He accepted collective responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi government and warned of the dangers of modern dictatorship. Hitler's dictatorship differed in one fundamental point from all its predecessors in history, he said. It was the first dictatorship in the present period of modern technical development. A dictatorship that made complete use of all technical means in a manner never known before. By means of such instruments, the dictatorship could consolidate itself, and further, it could deprive people of their freedom. This admission distinguished Speer from the others. The Allied prosecutors took note. British and American officials saw in Speer a man who might serve as a warning rather than just an example. He was intelligent, articulate, and willing to reflect on his role. In the American press, he was dubbed the Nazi who said sorry. Some viewed him as sincere, others suspected he was simply clever enough to reframe his image. The court ultimately convicted Speer on counts 3 and 4, war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judges acknowledged that he had not personally ordered atrocities but found that he had played a central role in the system that enabled them. He had used forced labor, coordinated with the SS, and overseen a ministry deeply embedded in Nazi operations. However, his cooperation, apparent remorse, and opposition to the scorched earth policy likely spared him a death sentence. On October 1, 1946, Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he would serve his full sentence alongside 6 other Nazi leaders. He avoided execution, a fate that befell 12 of his co-defendants, including Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Göring, who committed suicide the night before his hanging. Reactions to Speer's sentence were mixed. Some in the United States and Britain believed he had received a fair judgment, neither too harsh nor too lenient. Others saw it as proof that intelligence and presentation could manipulate justice. Survivors of Nazi brutality questioned how a man who had helped run the war economy and benefited from slave labor could be spared death. In Germany, his case sparked debate about guilt, responsibility, and post-war identity. Inside prison, Speer began to reinvent himself once again. He kept detailed journals, read philosophy and literature, and began drafting what would become his best-selling memoirs. He continued to portray himself as a repentant technocrat, haunted by the past but committed to introspection. He maintained that he had been unaware of the Holocaust, though historians and survivors doubted the plausibility of this claim, given his rank and access. What set Speer apart was not just what he admitted, but how he admitted it. His guilt seemed measured, intellectual, and emotionally distant. He framed his complicity as the result of ambition, not malice. This narrative resonated with a post-war audience seeking explanations for how civilized, educated people could become part of a genocidal regime. For some, Speer offered an answer. For others, he remained a master manipulator, skilled not only in architecture, but in the construction of self-image. 8. Spandau years, 1946 to 1966. Albert Speer entered Spandau prison in Berlin in July 1947, beginning a 20-year sentence that would reshape both his public image and his own understanding of the past. The prison, located in the British sector of Berlin, was jointly operated by the 4 Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. It housed 7 high-ranking Nazi convicts: Speer, Rudolf Hess, Karl Donitz, Baldur von Skyrek, Erich Raeder, Walther Funk, and Konstantin von Neurath. The men were kept under strict conditions, with rotating guards and limited contact with the outside world. Spandau was austere, monotonous, and heavily symbolic, a reminder of Nazi crimes and Allied unity. From the start, Speer adjusted to prison life with discipline and routine. He woke early, cleaned his cell meticulously, and engaged in long hours of reading and writing. He exercised daily and kept a careful journal, documenting his thoughts, reflections, and memories. Unlike some of the other inmates who continued to express Nazi sympathies or retreated into denial, Speer maintained a posture of remorse. He distanced himself from his fellow prisoners ideologically and emotionally, focusing instead on introspection. The Soviets, however, were skeptical of Speer's apparent transformation. They saw his sentence as too lenient and considered his behavior in prison as strategic rather than sincere. Soviet guards monitored him closely and often reported that his remorse seemed rehearsed. Western officials, particularly the British and Americans, took a more sympathetic view. To them, Speer represented a different kind of Nazi, one who was educated, self-critical, and willing to accept responsibility. This divide would persist throughout his imprisonment. During his time at Spandau, Speer completed two major works, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries. These writings, which he composed in longhand and smuggled out through family and lawyers, would later be published and widely read. Inside the Third Reich, released in 1969, offered a detailed account of life inside Hitler's circle. It described meetings with the Führer, interactions with top officials, and reflections on architecture, power, and war. The book was structured, analytical, and largely free of ideological justification. Speer acknowledged his guilt but continued to insist that he had been unaware of the Holocaust. Spandau, The Secret Diaries, published in 1975, was more personal. It chronicled his daily life in prison, his thoughts, dreams, regrets, and philosophical musings. Speer portrayed himself as a man seeking redemption through reflection. He wrote about loneliness, the passage of time, and the burden of memory. The tone was reflective but guarded. Critics noted that while he expressed sorrow, he rarely confronted the full human cost of his actions. He spoke often of his own suffering but less about the suffering he had helped facilitate. While in prison, Speer remained connected to the outside world through a limited number of visits and correspondence. His wife, Margaret, visited periodically, though their relationship had become strained. She had endured public shame and financial hardship during his imprisonment, raising their children largely alone. Their marriage, already distant before the war, became more formal and less intimate. Speer's children grew up with their father behind bars, some struggling to reconcile the image of a thoughtful prisoner with the legacy of a Nazi minister. Inmates at Spandau were allowed to work in the prison garden, library, and workshops. Speer found solace in physical labor and intellectual work. He built furniture, translated books, and immersed himself in architecture and history. He was known among the staff for his politeness and diligence. Despite the isolation, he maintained a structured life that mirrored his pre-war habits. He saw himself not as a victim, but as someone serving a deserved sentence. Yet controversy continued to surround him. Some historians accused Speer of rewriting his own history. They pointed out omissions in his memoirs, such as the extent of his knowledge about concentration camps and the use of slave labor. Documents uncovered in the decades after the war revealed that Speer had attended meetings where the persecution of Jews was discussed. While he may not have orchestrated genocidal policies, he operated within a system that depended on them and benefited from them directly. Critics argued that his carefully crafted image of the repentant Nazi was more performance than truth. As the 1950s progressed, international attention to Spandau dwindled. The other prisoners were released one by one after serving their sentences or due to illness. By 1966, only 3 remained: Speer, Hess, and Skyrock. Pressure mounted to release Speer early, especially given his age, behavior, and perceived rehabilitation. The Western powers supported early release, but the Soviet Union remained adamantly opposed. They insisted on full sentences for all war criminals, regardless of individual conduct. Negotiations stalled for years, and Speer continued to serve his time. On October 1, 1966, 20 years to the day after his sentencing, Albert Speer was released from Spandau. He walked out of the prison gates wearing a simple coat and carrying a briefcase. Press and reporters awaited him, eager to hear from the man who had built Hitler's war machine and lived to tell the tale. Speer gave only a brief statement: "I have served my sentence. I am free now." He then disappeared into a waiting car and returned to civilian life. Speer left prison physically older, but intellectually active. He had lost 20 years of freedom but gained a platform and a complex legacy. He emerged not as an exile, but as an author. His books would soon appear on bestseller lists in the United States, the United Kingdom, and West Germany. Some readers viewed him as a cautionary tale. Others saw in him a model of accountability. And still others believed he had gotten away with too much. In the 2 decades since his imprisonment began, Germany had transformed. The country was divided, rebuilt, and now navigating its place in a Cold War world. Speer returned not to a ruined Reich, but to a modern federal republic. His presence was controversial, but his voice, shaped by time, memory, and guilt, would soon echo far beyond the prison walls he had left behind. 9. Final years of reflection, 1966 to 1981. After his release from Spandau in 1966, Albert Speer returned to a world that had changed dramatically since the end of World War II. He settled quietly in Heidelberg, West Germany, choosing a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Though officially stripped of all former titles and barred from holding public office, Speer found a new identity. As a best-selling author, public intellectual, and controversial figure in the post-war effort to understand how civilized societies descend into dictatorship. His memoir Inside the Third Reich, published in 1969, became an international sensation. In the United States, it received extensive coverage in major newspapers and was reviewed in outlets like the New York Times and Time magazine. American readers, fascinated by Spee's proximity to Hitler, saw the book as an insider's look at the mysterious inner workings of the Nazi regime. The memoir combined detailed recollections with personal reflection, presenting Spee as a man who had been seduced by ambition and blinded by duty. His narrative was clean, articulate, and almost literary, a stark contrast to the bombast and fanaticism associated with many Nazi leaders. In the US, the book sold widely, appearing in airport bookstores and college libraries. High school and college educators occasionally used excerpts to teach about the Holocaust and the structure of totalitarian regimes. Spee's ability to express remorse while maintaining a calm and rational tone resonated with a generation seeking explanations rather than condemnation. American culture at the time was wrestling with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and national introspection. In that climate, Spee's narrative of complicity and regret fit into broader conversations about responsibility and morality. Spee gave television interviews, appeared in documentaries, and wrote articles for German and international publications. He was invited to academic forums and political discussions, though never as a representative of any political party. In interviews, he continued to express guilt, particularly about the use of forced labor under his administration. He admitted to moral failure, often repeating that his greatest crime was closing his eyes to what was happening around him. Still, he insisted he had no knowledge of the final solution until after the war, an assertion that remained controversial and widely disputed by scholars. Historians, journalists, and Holocaust survivors challenged Spee's version of events. Evidence emerged that Spee had attended meetings where Jewish deportations and extermination efforts were discussed. Though he may not have ordered or overseen these operations directly, his proximity to them made his claims of ignorance difficult to accept. Critics accused him of selective memory, deflection, and crafting a narrative that absolved him of deeper accountability. The debate over whether Spee was truly remorseful or simply an excellent manipulator became a central theme in post-war historiography. Despite the criticism, Spee remained a media figure in Germany and abroad. His second major book, Spandau, The Secret Diaries, published in 1975, added a personal and philosophical layer to his public image. It chronicled his daily life in prison, his gardening routines, his dreams, his letters, and his struggles with guilt. The book received mixed reviews. Some readers appreciated its introspective tone, while others saw it as self-indulgent or evasive. Still, it reinforced Spee's role as the most reflective and articulate of the surviving Nazi elite. In the United States, Spee's legacy remained complex. He was seen by some as a model of how a person could confront past mistakes. Others argued that he had cleverly shielded himself from deeper scrutiny by offering just enough remorse to gain public sympathy. For many Americans interested in World War II history, Spee occupied a gray area, neither hero nor villain, but a case study in moral failure and human contradiction. In his final years, Spee lived a relatively quiet life. He traveled occasionally to lectures or interviews, but spent most of his time writing and walking in the hills around Heidelberg. He continued to correspond with scholars, journalists, and former colleagues. He maintained contact with his children, though his family life remained strained. Margaret, his wife, stayed with him but kept a low profile. Their relationship, shaped by decades of separation and trauma, remained emotionally distant. Spee expressed admiration for post-war German democracy and often spoke in favor of reconciliation and reflection. He remained loyal to no political ideology, though he was occasionally critical of West Germany's reluctance to fully confront its Nazi past. He supported educational efforts about the Holocaust and expressed regret that his generation had failed to protect Germany's moral and cultural foundations. In 1981, Spee traveled to London to give an interview for a BBC documentary. After the taping, he suffered a stroke and was taken to St. Mary's Hospital. He died shortly after, on September 1, 1981, at the age of 76. The news of his death made headlines around the world. Obituaries appeared in major American newspapers and networks. Some praised his honesty and intellect, others reminded readers of his complicity and the millions who had suffered under his watch. Albert Speer's final chapter was one of contradiction, an educated man who helped build a regime of terror, a skilled manager who organized war through exploitation, and a reflective writer who shaped his own legacy in real time. His life remained a cautionary tale, particularly for students and citizens in democratic societies. He demonstrated how ambition, loyalty, and the desire to belong could lead even the most capable minds into systems of immense cruelty. If you've watched this far, you probably enjoy our videos, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It really helps us grow, and we appreciate your support. Thank you. That was today's journey through history. Leave a comment, share the video, and stay with us. BioExplainer is just getting started.